We conclude this lecture by making some additional considerations on this very interesting economic model. First of all, we just gave a rationale, we just gave a reason for why some countries, some groups in the economy rather than some countries, might be opposed to trade. Suppose that you live in a country that is extremely capital abundant, like the United States. We have seen in the data at the beginning of this class that capital per worker in the United States is way higher than in other countries such as China and Mexico. If this model of the economy works, then it's legitimate to think that the US will tend to export goods that use capital very intensely and import goods that use labor intensely. Well, in a nation like the United States, we know from the result that we've stated before that if we open up to trade, labor will be harmed through lower wages and capital will benefit through higher rate of returns. So in the economy, groups that want to protect labor and represent the interest of labor, such as labor unions, will naturally oppose international trade agreements and trade liberalizations. It seems that we have some evidence in the real life, in the political debate, in the policy debate about labor unions that oppose trade agreements. And so this seems to be a little confirmation that this model of the economy and this model of trade might be an adequate model to think about these kind of economic issues. On the other hand, you will have that other groups in the economy which benefit from trade will probably lobby the government to make trade agreements, right? So we have an interesting dynamic of conflict that emerges in this very simple economic model. We always should remember that, as in lecture 3, even in lecture 4, we still jump on a higher indifference curve from opening up to trade. This means that overall, at least on average, the economy is better off. Do we remember in lecture 2 what we said? We said that the indifference curve that we consider is a community indifference curve that represents kind of like the average preferences of the consumers in the economy. So the average person in the economy is better off, even in this world, from opening up to trade. But now we have an interesting contrast between scarce factors owners and abundant factor owners. It would be interesting to see, and there are some forms of this in real life, systems to redistribute the gains from opening up to trade towards the categories in the economy that lost from opening up to trade. Finally, I have left you with some reflections on income inequality and trade. So it's not a mystery that in the last 60 years, income inequality in the United States has been first going down for a bit, and then it's been ramping up, especially after the 1970s. There's a lot of discussion. You must have heard the 1% versus the 99%, and that movement on the widening of this income gap between the very top income earners and the rest of the economy. Now, let's think about it in the perspective of this model of trade. We have whoever owns the capital in the economy in a country that is capital abundant that benefits. And so the rate of return on their investment will go up if we open up to trade, while the owners of labor, so workers, will be harmed by their wage going down if we open up to trade. This seems to offer a mechanism that can explain, at least partially, the widening of the income gap in this country. Notice, we're not just thinking about the United States. The widening of the income gap is something that happened in other developed nations. In slide 40, I'm reporting not only the share of income in the United States owned by different percentiles of the income distribution. And you can see that there's a widening gap between the 95th percentile in the picture on the left, which is the top 5% of the income distribution, and the median income, so the average person kind of in the economy, the person that stays in between, or the 20th percentile, so the bottom 20% of the distribution. We see that over time in the left graph, there's this distance that becomes wider and wider and wider between top income earners and bottom income earners in the United States. But then I'm also plotting a graph that represents the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, we see from the 1920s that we are representing here the share of income of the top 10% of the income distribution. We see that in the 1920s, that was very high. It went steadily decreasing up to the 1980s. And then from the 1980s to almost today, this share of total income of the top 10% has been going up. Now, we just said, in this economic model, we can have an explanation for this statistical fact, which is maybe we have opened up to trade, and this has caused the income gap to become larger and larger. Economists, and in particular Robert Fenstra at UC Davis, have tried to estimate what is the contribution of opening up to trade to this increase in income inequality. There's a large debate in academia about how much trade can contribute to explain this widening of the income inequality. Robert Fenstra found it estimates that range between 15 and 30%, telling us that trade is a factor, but it's not a majority factor, and it's not the most important factor. Finally, let me tell you something about inequality. If we look at slide 41, we can see the Gini income of income inequality across countries in the world. What is the Gini income? Well, it would be probably fairly complicated to explain in detail what it means, but think about it as if I have a low score for the Gini income, the distribution of income is very equal in the population, meaning that there's not a lot of distance between the richest people and the poorest people. While a Gini income of 1 would mean that all the income is owned by one person in the economy and everybody else has nothing, which means that there's very large dispersion of income in the economy. Well, we can see that the United States are kind of in between. The most equal countries in the world are in Eastern Europe and plus Sweden. If we think about Eastern Europe, these are countries that were under communist domination up to about 30 years ago, so that maybe is not too surprising that there's such a small inequality between income across people in these countries. And then some of the countries that have the highest level of dispersion in income, so biggest distance between top and bottom, they're mainly located in Central and South America, so in Latin America. And we see that at the top of these, we have Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, and at number 5, we have Bolivia. Bolivia has a Gini coefficient of 56. If we were to look for the United States, we would have to go further down, and the United States have a Gini coefficient of income inequality of 43.2. This helps us putting a little bit in perspective the idea of how bad or how big is income inequality in the United States, which is a country where we live in, compared to the rest of the world. We hear a lot about the fact that income inequality in the United States, it's bigger than in other developed countries. But if we look at the entire world, it's not as bad.